Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's new digital platform that will enable you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. We are honored to be joined today by His Excellency Philippe Etienne, Ambassador of France to the United States, a distinguished diplomat who, impressively, previously served as France's ambassador to Germany, then as the diplomatic advisor to President Macron before coming to Washington last year. AJC has had the pleasure of meeting with him both in France and in Washington. Ambassador Etienne will be in conversation with AJC CEO David Harris. After we hear from the ambassador and David, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. David, you have the floor.
Bill, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or perhaps I should say bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. It's a great pleasure for me to be in conversation with my friend Philippe Etienne. I'm also delighted that Anne-Claire Legendaire, the French Consul General in New York, is joining us on this call. And before I invite Philippe to offer an opening comment, I just want to share one interesting historical fact that in a way helps frame this conversation. What is the oldest diplomatic relationship the United States has with any country in the world? To which country did the infant United States send its first, it was then called minister, not ambassador? Well, as you can imagine from this conversation, it was to France in the 18th century. And an interesting historical fact, who was that first ambassador of the United States to France? None other than Benjamin Franklin. So when speaking to Philippe Etienne, we're speaking with the representative of a country that has been by the side of the United States since the very beginning. Philippe, welcome to the American Jewish Committee Advocacy Anywhere program. We're delighted you're with us.
Well, thank you very much, David. I would like first to thank Ambassador Harris for having me at AJC. For the first time since I took my position as ambassador, but we met on my very first trip in New York, David, 9 months ago. And it was a privilege for me to be with you, with such a good friend of France, but also to have various opportunities to meet with the membership of your organization in New York, but also in Miami, in Houston, and to work with this organization with which France has been working very closely on many issues, transatlantic relationships, security of Israel, the fight against anti-Semitism, many issues of foreign policy. And today I am very happy to talk with you about the pandemics in France and about its different dimensions. And since you have mentioned history, just to tell you, I have put on my tie with the Clé de la Bastille. I bought it in Mount Vernon. It depicts the key of the prison La Bastille, which was offered by Lafayette to George Washington.
Well, Philippe, and just one more historical footnote, and then we move on to the subjects of the day. AJC's first trip to France was 1919, 101 years ago, when a delegation of the American Jewish Committee traveled to attend the Paris Peace Conference and to meet with the world leaders, including Clemenceau, Woodrow Wilson, who were shaping the new order of the world after the First World War. So our relationship with France goes back now over a century. As we meet, Philippe, France is facing a very difficult challenge with coronavirus. I believe that France has the 4th highest number of cases and fatalities in the world. Can you share with us what is the current status of that struggle, and do you see some light at the end of the tunnel?
Thank you, David. Yes, we see some light because our president has announced that France will start the process of reopening on May 11, after a full month of complete and quite drastic lockdown. Our Prime Minister has just today presented the plan for ending the quarantine. It will be a very, very cautious, very progressive. It will depend on the local situations. It will start with different parts of our society, including a progressive opening of schools. And it will help this reopening of schools to bring back the workforce. But it will be very cautious, but very prudent. The situation of the pandemics in France is indeed that we are stabilizing at a very high plateau. The number of deaths per day remains at a high level, from 200 to 400. What is encouraging is that the numbers of people in hospitals, and still more important, the number of patients in intensive care units, both numbers are going down every day and have been going down already since some time. It means that the strategy of generalized lockdown is beginning to bear fruit. This strategy was consisted in doubling the numbers of ICU beds, but also to have this lockdown. And now we see the effects of this effort, which was mostly concentrated in the 3 or 4 regions which were mostly hit. Not the whole territory has been hit the same way. East and the region around Paris and Eastern France has been mostly hit. We had a huge solidarity. Healthcare staff came to those regions. We had also experiences such as high-speed trains, which have been medicalized, which allowed us to take hundreds of patients to other regions which were not that burdened for the first time. Our army has helped with medical transport. Our neighboring countries have helped. Germany, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Austria have taken nearly 200 patients from our most burdened hospitals. And maybe a word also on our economic response. The most important for us was to save jobs and to avoid business failures. So although the rate of unemployment is, of course, increasing very much, we have adopted the most generous short-time working scheme in Europe. Almost 1 in 2 private sector employees, which means 9 million employees, are concerned, which means that they have money from the state, but they stay employed in their businesses. And the cost of it is estimated at 24 billion euros. We have just voted a new budgetary law with a total of 110 billion euros, which is more than 5% of the GDP, with this scheme, but also with the deferral of taxes for 42 billion euros, with a solidarity fund for very small enterprises, and also with 20 billion targeted for the state as shareholder to help companies. The social response was also very important. We have devoted exceptional aid to disadvantaged families and to workers to pay for fixed necessities. This is broadly the answer. This is also the state of affairs. Happy to get into more details on some of these dimensions.
I mean, needless to say, Philippe, we wish for better days ahead for France and for every affected country, including our own. France was one of the founders of the European project. In fact, Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet are widely credited with having conceived of building what is today the European Union. And yet there have been questions raised in the last couple of months, as you know, about whether the European Union showed sufficient solidarity with its member states. In fact, President Ursula von der Leyen recently apologized in a way, particularly to Italy, which felt somewhat abandoned initially. This comes after Great Britain left the European Union, and with questions being raised about Poland and Hungary, but for other reasons. Could you describe, will the European Union survive? Will it emerge stronger, or could it, we hope not, emerge weaker as a consequence of recent events?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because we are now close to the 9th of May, which will be the 70th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration in 1950, which has started this incredible, unique, in history, unique build up of the European integration. And to answer to your question, I'm convinced that like from other crises before this one, the European Union will grow stronger. Although this crisis, of course, is probably much bigger than everything we have experienced. We have, of course, at the beginning, as you mentioned, you quoted President von der Leyen, but it was true all over the world. Let's be frank. Everybody has taken some time to find the answers, and for the European Union, it was still more complex because health policies are national competences, not shared European competences. But the European Union has shown solidarity. Our president was among the first ones who asked for the convening of a European summits. The leaders have met sometimes already. Last time, it was last week. They have met on the 10th of March, the first time, to address all the dimensions of the crisis. So the solidarity has been shown in something very important, which is the repatriation of all the Europeans stranded in foreign countries. We have repatriated 160,000 French citizens from all countries in the world. It has been done in the framework of European schemes, and we have helped each other very much. I have mentioned already the solidarity with patients, French patients taken to hospitals in other countries. And we have had a lot of decisions to manage together medical supplies, to manage the borders, internal borders, to embark on common efforts to develop new therapeutical treatments and new vaccines. Some of the clinical trials are going on quite well. For instance, we have launched the test of 4 experimental treatments between 8 European countries. So it shows also a very important dimension of the European policies. And we are taking action in the economic field as a European Union. Like the Fed in the US, the European Central Bank has taken an extraordinary decision, 750 billion euros plan to buy bonds, not only state bonds, but also corporate bonds, so to support business. 500 billion euros to support the economies of the EU member states. 100 billion euros for a new scheme, EU scheme to fight against unemployment, and a lot of more money coming from the EU budget. Of course, it remains to decide on the recovery, a new recovery fund. We all agreed last week, the leaders agreed to have a recovery fund, but we have still to agree on the content of this recovery fund, on its financing, and we are waiting for a proposal by the European Commission. It will be a very, very essential part of the answer by the European Union, because we need a symmetric recovery to mitigate the risk of asymmetric consequences. You mentioned Italy. The crisis has hit first Italy, then Spain, then France. we are not all in the same situation, but we must give a unified answer to allow the European economies to rebound together very strongly. And finally, just a last word, the European Union response has been very strong to help other countries in the world. We've starting with our neighborhood, Western Balkans, Eastern, Southern neighborhood. The European Union and Commission has earmarked 15.6 billion euros for this help to the most vulnerable countries, also, especially Africa. Maybe we will come back to Africa.
I hope there's time for Africa as well. But Philippe, but just staying on this theme for a moment, there have emerged sort of two distinct schools of thought in this pandemic situation. One that says it's time to strengthen bonds of global cooperation. Borders are meaningless. A pandemic doesn't respect borders, for example. And the other school that says, no, this only reinforces the need for the nation state and a reaffirmation of nationalism and borders and concentration on those within our borders. Are those two schools of thought irreconcilable? Or how do you see the world going forward? How do you see France's view of the world going forward?
Well, I will distinguish the two timelines. In the short term, we have to address together this threat. It is a global threat. It must be answered by a global answer. It must be answered by a global policies. And this is the reason why France and President Macron was quite active in the last weeks. We have promoted all sorts of international initiatives on all important levels. For instance, having a first step for debt relief for the most vulnerable, 70 most vulnerable countries. We got to this decision through a decision of the G20 finance ministers, France being president of the Paris Club, and we had the support of all members of the G20. All of them are not members of the so-called Paris Club, but also G7 with interaction and with the support and the leadership of the American presidency. United Nations Security Council, to answer the call by the General Secretary for a ceasefire, universal ceasefire on humanitarian pause. France, as permanent member of the Security Council, has taken many initiatives here too. And also with the African leaders, because here we felt we have, as a world, a special responsibility. And finally, on global health, we have just launched an initiative, ACT Accelerator, to cooperate globally to find and to share and to deliver to all countries diagnosis testing, therapeutical treatments and vaccines. So this is the first timeline. We have no time to lose. We must act together. Then we will have to learn the lessons from the crisis. And I think, to answer frankly your question, we will need to draw lessons both in terms of maybe more sovereignty in very, very sensitive fields, but also more cooperation, more efficiency in the international cooperation. Both of them are not contradictory. By the way, our president, in his speech in 2017, speaking about the European Union, giving his European vision, already then in September 2017, spoke about a European sovereignty. We must probably, in the longer term, find ways to be more sovereign, but also to be more efficient in our global cooperation and to address such challenges like the climate change. We must not forget the other global challenges in a more efficient way. And these challenges, these global challenges, like the pandemics today, can only be addressed efficiently if we are together, if we strengthen the cooperation among nations, and if we renew, if we reinvent multilateralism, which is up to this task.
So I read recently an interview with your foreign minister, Minister Le Drian in Le Monde, a week ago, Philippe, in which, among other things, he raised some concerns both about China and some of the statements that China had made criticizing France on the one hand, and we've heard concerns about China elsewhere in Europe as well, but also concerns about the transatlantic relationship. And the fact, for example, that the United States withdrew from the withdrew funding from the World Health Organization. And the lesson that he seemed to draw, maybe I'm reading too much into the interview, was that Europe itself must rise on the global stage, must become a more active global player with its own vision, because clearly, while it has to work with China and the United States absolutely in different ways, the recent developments showed that Europe must become more of a leader in its own right. Is that a correct reading, or did I misread it?
Well, how could you have misread H? No, I think you cannot put all partners in the same basket. I would say you have, on the one hand, this idea of European sovereignty, which is for us completely consistent with the Transatlantic Alliance, including in the field of defense. The United States has consistently been asking for the Europeans to do more for their own defense. So we need to as you said, as our minister said, as you read his statement, we must do more. To be more active as a European Union. But of course, we will continue to defend the same values, the same democratic values, together with the United States. This is very important, I think, for the efficiency of our transatlantic partnership, which needs a stronger Europe. Not only in defense, by the way, but also in all fields which are relevant today in the world as we know it. But the European Union has been already playing this leadership role in some very important fields, such as the fight against climate change and the objective of having carbon neutrality in 2050, for instance, has been promoted first and foremost by the European Union. So it is not completely new, but we must probably be more active as the European Union in many other fields. You asked also a question about China. We had also during this crisis a very active dialogue and cooperation. Since our minister, for instance, said he has had I think five discussions with his Chinese counterpart during this crisis. And we have, as Europeans, as France, delivered healthcare material as an aid to Wuhan during when the crisis was very dangerous in China. Now we have received some healthcare goods from China. Of course, we think it's a normal way of cooperating. When you have more difficulties, you help the one who has more difficulties. But at the same time, our minister also said we cannot accept some statements, such as statements made by the Chinese embassy in Paris. And so you see, our reaction has been very firm, and we do not accept some narratives which misrepresent completely the action of our country or of healthcare staff to protect our population during these pandemics.
So, Belle, I'm going to ask the ambassador two more questions, and you can begin to assemble the questions from our audience. Philippe, you've referenced President Macron more than once, of course. Let me share with you this quote from the president, in which he said, "This period will have taught us a lot. Many certainties and convictions will be swept away. We will draw the consequences, all the consequences." Can you help us understand what he meant by that and what may change?
Well, I think we will listen from him when he finds the time adequate to say what consequences he sees. We must draw from lessons, but probably here we have both important lessons to learn from our internal policies in France itself, but also for Europe and for the world. I think you have addressed it already a little when you asked a couple of minutes ago whether we would be more everybody behind its borders, or we would more cooperate. I answered, it's my personal view, of course, that probably we would need to have, I said more sovereignty because it was the word used by our president already back in 2017 for the European Union, but we will still need, another type of cooperation. Already before this crisis, we have seen multilateral organizations which found it difficult to address the challenges. One good example being the WTO. We said, why not? We should reform the WTO, but we must keep rules to have a level playing field in trade. So we will have probably to draw, and we will have surely to draw many lessons, both internally. I speak for my country, of course. The way our solidarity can be secured, the way our health policies, our hospitals are helped. What are the professions which were crucial at the forefront against the battle? How we can prepare better and help those professions better? Many consequences, but also consequences on the European and international levels.
Philippe, thank you. So let me ask you one other question, completely by accident, but 30 minutes ago, Israel began to celebrate its Independence Day, its 72nd Independence Day. And maybe I can just take a second to say that France was among the original supporters of the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947 to create a Jewish state and an Arab state alongside it. France was one of the countries that was sympathetic to the efforts to bring survivors after the war to British mandatory Palestine before Israel was established. And until 1967, France was the principal defense partner and weapons supplier for Israel. Would you have a message for our audience on this birthday for Israel? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I can't help it because it's a big day for Israel and its friends. What would your message be?
Well, the message has been given, I think, by our president when he visited Israel last January. Of course, we want to remain this very close friend to Israel, as we have always been since the birth of Israel and of the modern state of Israel. And we have always said how it was essential for us to have Israel to have the security of Israel being respected, and even if we can disagree on certain things, we want to keep this very, very close relationship. And I wish all our Israeli friends all the best. And in spite of this particular circumstances of the fight against pandemics, where Israel also is making, like all other nations, an incredible job, I wish all of our friends all the best on this day. And I recall this message of friendship, which our president gave during his visit last January.
Philippe, thank you. And Belle, I'm going to turn it over to you for our questions.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Ambassador. I just want to remind our viewers that you can email your questions to questions@ajc.org. Questions is plural, or you can use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Ambassador, for our first question, we're getting a couple of questions about your comments on the Transatlantic Partnership, so I'm going to group a couple of them together. First, Robert in Atlanta says, it seems that the pandemic crisis is only adding to the growing set of challenges for the Transatlantic Partnership. How would you evaluate the current status of French-American relations? Is there further room for cooperation and things that we can be doing better together? And similarly, Simon in Berlin is asking, how do you see the French-German relationship, one of the most important relationships on the global stage at all times, evolving through this coronavirus crisis?
Well, thank you for the two very inspiring questions. If I take, I will try not to take too much time because both of them are so important. But first, on the transatlantic relations, on the relations between France and the US, excuse me, there has been a great number of conversations between the two presidents during this crisis. A close cooperation through the American presidency of G7, and also a very good cooperation at the level of the companies, many French companies, for instance, taking part to the effort on the US territory to redirect their production to make healthcare goods and protective equipments, which the hospitals here need. It's a good example of a very pragmatic cooperation in the economic field, but also in the scientific field. Institutions like INSERM or Institut Pasteur in France have very, very close cooperations with many universities and research institutions from California to New York to develop, to test new treatments against, to test efficient treatments against COVID-19. So a very vibrant cooperation activated by this crisis, which just doesn't mean that, of course, we agreed on everything. For instance, on the WHO, we said we should continue to support the WHO now, even if we have at one point here too to draw the consequences. We have proposed some reforms. Our minister has made proposals, but in spite of those differences of view on some points, a really very, very close cooperation over the last weeks. With Germany, of course, it's still much closer because when we in the European Union have to face such an incredible crisis, we must absolutely be sure that France and Germany put together to help the European Union to take the right decisions at the right time, and sufficiently bold decisions. And indeed, we have, as I said, I will not repeat what I said, the EU has taken very, very many decisions. I mentioned also the fact that German hospitals have taken patients when the hospitals in Eastern France were overburdened, and especially their intensive care units. Now we have this more difficult, I wouldn't say more difficult, but this decision which is so important to take on the recovery fund of the European Union, where we have a classical conversation not only between Germany and France, but between different groups of the European Union, of countries of the European Union, about what sort of financing should we have a mutual guarantees or common guarantees, or through the EU budget and so on. It is being discussed. I am sure that, and Chancellor Merkel and President Macron also have discussed very, very much on this through the summits I mentioned. I am sure we will, Germany and France and Germany will help taking the right decisions in all fields where we need to have a strong European decision taking for preparing the future and for preparing the recovery.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have a question coming in from Yakov in Brazil, who asks, France, as you mentioned, has a strong bilateral relationship with Israel, and thank you for your very nice comments on Israel's Independence Day. But based on my perception, it seems that in multilateral forums in Brussels and at the United Nations, France seems to be more critical when it comes to Israel, on Israel and Israel policy. And that seems at odds with some of the good relationship that we've seen otherwise with France and Israel. Can you help clarify the situation for us?
Well, it depends. there are decisions taken where we have our own positions. It doesn't prevent us to have a very good cooperation, and it all, of course, in some very important fields of policy in the Middle East, we have both a very close exchange of views and consultation, but it might happen and that we take our views, and including on some decisions taken by the authorities in Israel. But it has not prevented us in the last years. I mentioned the visit by our president in January, but it doesn't prevent us to recall and to reconfirm this very close relation. We had in 2018, I think, French-Israeli season of culture, which has enlightened not only the cultural ties, but also the technological cooperation we have between two very high, two countries which have very big capacities in high tech. So I don't see a contradiction between those two aspects.
Thank you, Ambassador. John in Los Angeles is asking, France has been hardly hit by terrorism in the past, mostly coming from French nationals who had been radicalized and traveled to join ISIS in Syria. Yesterday, 2 policemen were targeted by what seems to be someone who identified himself with ISIS. Is there a concern that ISIS and other terrorist organizations will try to take advantage of the current pandemic situation?
Well, thank you for recalling that France has been recently hit by terrorism, indeed, and yes, it's quite possible that some forces want to take advantage from this pandemics to increase their criminal or terrorist activities. This is a reason why, and thank you for the question, because it's really important to underline it. We must absolutely not lower our guard, not diminish our capacities, not neglect our policies in the fight against terrorism in particular. It is what France is doing, being at the forefront of the fight against terrorism in Sahel, with the support of many European nations and with the US helping us also. But France is really at the forefront, together with the G5 Sahel countries and with other African nations. We must continue this. We must continue this also in Iraq, for instance. We must continue the fight against Daesh, because Daesh will continue to attack us if they find the possibility of doing it, both internally and internationally.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're also getting a couple of different questions about anti-Semitism in France. I'm going to group a couple of them together. Adriana is wondering, how is the French government reacting to rising levels of feelings of insecurity for the Jewish community in France, since they have been experiencing since the early 2000s? And Juliette in Paris, who I guess is involved with our AJC Paris office, mentioned that AJC Paris did a study in the beginning of the year that found that 7 out of 10 French Jews are experiencing or have experienced anti-Semitism. This number is particularly high among young people ages 18 to 24. How concerned is the French government that, given conspiracy theories and other things emerging out of the pandemic, that there'll be another surge of anti-Semitism?
Well, we know, and we have recognized, and we have really recognized that not only for our country, by the way, also in Europe, in the US in general, anti-Semitism is on the rise, and it's clear that we must not only condemn it in words, but we must also act against this. We have said consistently and repeatedly that every anti-Semitist act in France, France having the 3rd largest Jewish community in the world, is an attack against the Republic, against the whole of our country, against the essence of what we want to be and what we are as a French Republic. so we cannot tolerate this anti-Semitism, whatever its origin is, because there are different ideological origins there. And we do not accept it, and we act against it. Our president has been very clear about what he considers as being anti-Semitic, as being anti-Semitism. He has made quite important statements. For instance, when the Prime Minister Netanyahu visited France 2 years ago, the French Parliament has adopted this definition of anti-Semitism. We see clearly a number of priorities to act. One of them, of course, maybe the most important in the short term, of course, is the protection of all places where which could fear to be the targets of anti-Semitic attacks, synagogue, schools. There was definitely a strengthening of the protection and also of the repression of all groups having this anti-Semitic ideology. But we also want to act against it is second priority. We want to act very efficiently against the propagation of hatred speech, and especially hatred speech on internet. It is something where we have, and our president in particular, but our country in general, they have dedicated many efforts to convince both the tech sector, but also the other countries and the international community to have a joint effort to ban, to delete all contents which can lead to the perpetration of terrorist actions, and especially against some communities, and in particular anti-Semitist actions. We have done some good progress with the tech sector, and we had also some important initiatives such as a Christchurch call together between the French president and New Zealand's prime minister. But we must act much more together, and it's also something where we can act more with more efficiently with the US, both government and private sector. And the third priority I would flag is definitely education, and because in the long term it's the only way to prevent propaganda, anti-Semitist propaganda, to take roots in the soul, in the head of your young people. So we have a program. Our Minister of Education is very active in this field. Just to give an example, we have had tens of thousands of young students, French students, visiting the Shoah Memorial in Paris. We are very much investing in this field. And we want to do very much. There is a national plan to combat anti-Semitism, a three-year action plan. So we have many other actions. I cannot dwell on in details, but we take it very seriously, and it is definitely a very high priority for us.
Thank you, Ambassador. Shuli in Jerusalem is asking, there seems to be quite the difference between France and the United States on the best way to deal with Iran today. Is the difference between Washington and Paris as wide as it appears, or are the differences narrower than we've been led to believe?
Well, yes and no. I would say, first, it is not between France and the US, but between the US and other signatories of the JCPOA of July 14th, 2015 on the nuclear capacities of Iran. It's in particular, I would say, conversation between the United States on the one hand and the three European allies, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And then I say yes and no because we agree between the US and we Europeans on the basic objective which is absolutely essential, especially for our country in France. We are very much attached to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is to prevent Iran to ever acquire military nuclear instruments. It's absolutely essential, and of course we also agree on a second objective, which is to avoid escalations in the region. And once having said those two objectives, then there was a question about the JCPOA. While the United States decided to withdraw from the JCPOA, we Europeans said we better stay in the JCPOA because it is one instrument to reach our goals, but we propose to negotiate as a complement different other parts of our relation with Iran, which are nuclear capacities beyond the JCPOA, which are ballistic capacities, but also which are regional issues in the Middle East, Yemen, Syria, and so on. So I think we are still there, although unfortunately, and we have condemned this, Iran has taken itself since then some steps back from the JCPOA, and we remain convinced that we must solve these issues in a comprehensive way, as comprehensive as possible, to reach those two basic goals which I recalled and where I think we agree with the United States.
Thank you, Ambassador. David, I'm just going to ask one more question from our audience and then I'll turn it back to you. Jim Kaufman, president of AJC New England, is asking, does the debate continue within France regarding designation of Hezbollah in its entirety and not just the military wing as a terrorist organization, similar to allies such as the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom?
Yes, there is this discussion which is going on. For us, right now, the priority is clearly the stability of Lebanon. It's, as you know, a country which is, with Lebanon, we have a special relationship with our history. And we are, of course, aware of the big difficulties which are the ones which Lebanon is having right now. This is the reason why it is our primary objective. And in the short term, we have another discussion which is very important, which is in the United Nations, also the discussion of the mandate, the prolongation of the mandate of UNIFIL, which is the United Nations force in South Lebanon, where we are also very much attached to it.
So, first of all, I want to thank you, Philippe Etienne, for sharing your time and your thoughts with our worldwide audience. I also want to tell our audience, just in the concluding moments here, why AJC for over a century has attached so much importance to our relationship with France. Why, as I mentioned at the beginning, we were there in 1919. Why we have an office in Paris today. Why our European headquarters are based in Paris. And in fact, why, after the Second World War, when we opened our office, one of your predecessors, Philippe, Jean-David Levitte's father, Georges Levitte, became the staff director of the American Jewish Committee office in Paris for a number of years. His son, Jean-David, became the ambassador to the United Nations from France and was diplomatic advisor to President Sarkozy, a position you held subsequently. And I think the answer to why we attach so much importance was contained in the comments you heard. This is our oldest bilateral relationship between the United States and any country in the world, number one. Number two, France is the home to the third largest Jewish community in the world. Number three, France was the founding member, in many respects, the creator of the European Union, the 27 member nations, which form such a formidable political and economic power. Number 4, France has had a relationship with Israel since its rebirth in 1947-48, and France has wider interests in the Middle East as well. I can keep going on why France is so important. Again, as Philippe said, in France's relationship with Israel, there are agreements and there are disagreements. We too at AJC sometimes have our disagreements, but we always approach each issue as friends and partners. We understand the importance of France. And Philippe, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for sharing your thoughts with us today and reminding us all why France matters so much to the American Jewish Committee, to the United States, and the future direction of our world. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for these words of friendship. We are very much in France attached also to the friendship with the American Jewish community. Thank you also for the work you are doing, this amazing work, and including these activities during our stay-at-home period. And all the best.
As we say, à bientôt.
À bientôt. All the best to your membership, and thank you again for inviting
me. We meet again soon. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, David. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. To support AJC's vital work around the world, please visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will be tomorrow, Wednesday, April 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern. Dr. Stephen Boehm, AJC's longtime Director of Contemporary Jewish Life, will discuss AJC's distinctive ethos as a Jewish organization and how that has expressed itself throughout his 4 decades within the agency. To register for this program, please visit ajc.org/advocacy anywhere. Please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Thank you.